I remember the precise moment I stopped being Matthias Kell and became something that processes data without understanding what the data means. It happened in a windowless chamber on the 47th sub-level of the Tricorn Palace on Scintilla, surrounded by 17 cogitator banks that hummed with a frequency that made my enhanced neural implants vibrate inside my skull. The tech adept who had just finished my final augmentation surgery was washing my blood from his mechadendrites in a basin of sanctified machine oil that smelled like burnt copper and ozone, and the Inquisitor, whose name I was not permitted to know, was handing me my first assignment. A data crystal containing 40,000 entries that I would spend the next 3 weeks analyzing without ever learning what any of those numbers actually represented. The temperature in that room was exactly 18 degrees Celsius, cold enough that I could see my breath misting in the recycled air, and my fingers, still trembling from the neural surgery, left small condensation prints on the crystal's surface as I accepted it. I thought I was being given purpose. I thought my genius would finally serve the Imperium in ways that mattered. I was wrong about everything except the serving part. Before they came for me, I was a statistical analyst in the Administratum's Munitorum division on Scintilla, one of 317,000 bureaucrats assigned to the subsector's supply chain logistics. My particular specialization was pattern recognition in resource distribution anomalies. I could look at 10,000 requisition forms and identify the 7 that indicated corruption, waste, or potential heresy with an accuracy that had earned me 3 commendations in a workspace with actual natural light from the hive's upper spire. I was 24 years old. My mind was sharp enough to hold 16 variable equations in working memory without augmentation, and I believed that intelligence work meant understanding the full picture of what you were analyzing. My mother had been a savant too, though her gift was for languages rather than numbers, and she had taught me that knowledge without context was just noise. She died when I was 17, a burst aneurysm during a late shift processing High Gothic translations for a cardinal's correspondence, her brilliant mind simply shutting off mid-sentence like a lamp whose power had been cut. I found her slumped over her desk, her last translation incomplete on the data slate before her, and I promised myself that when my mind eventually broke from the work, because all savants break eventually, that's just statistics, I would at least die understanding what I had accomplished. The Inquisition had other plans. The selection process was nothing like I expected. There were no tests, no interviews, no gradual escalation of clearance levels. One morning, I arrived at my workspace to find an inquisitorial seal affixed to my door, a simple black rosette that made everyone in the corridor avoid eye contact with me, as though I had already been declared excommunicate. 2 servo skulls followed me everywhere that day, their empty eye sockets tracking my movements with clicking optics that recorded everything I did. I attempted to continue my normal work, but found all my access codes had been changed, every file I tried to open displaying instead a single message in High Gothic: "Stand by for reassignment." By the afternoon, a chirurgeon savant arrived with a medical servitor carrying a case of neural augmentation equipment, and I was informed that I had been selected for immediate recruitment into the Inquisition's analytical division. Refusal was not mentioned as an option because refusal was not an option. By that evening I was in surgery, My skull opened and my brain interfaced with cognitive enhancement implants that would triple my processing speed and quadruple my memory capacity, while simultaneously ensuring that I could never discuss my work with anyone who lacked the proper clearance codes. The surgery took 11 hours. I was conscious for most of it, my mind held in chemically induced calm, while I felt pressure and vibration as they anchored crystalline neural lace throughout my cerebral cortex. The chirurgeon hummed a prayer to the Omnissiah as he worked, and I remember thinking that this was the beginning of something extraordinary, that I would finally see how all the pieces connected, that my genius would be put to use understanding the grand mechanisms of Imperial intelligence. I was extraordinarily naive. My first assignment, the one I received while still recovering from surgery, with bandages wrapped around my skull and my thoughts moving through my new implants with a crystalline clarity that felt simultaneously incredible and fundamentally wrong, was dataset designated Auric 77 Tertius. 40,000 entries. No context provided. The data arrived as pure numbers, coordinates without planetary references, dates without event descriptions, quantities without units specified, names rendered as alphanumeric designations. My task, according to the single-sentence instruction that accompanied the crystal, was to identify anomalous patterns and provide statistical analysis of deviation clusters. That was it. No explanation of what these numbers represented. No indication of whether I was analyzing troop movements or grain shipments or planetary populations or heretic cell activities. Just numbers, floating in a void of meaning, and my job was to tell someone what patterns I saw in the void. I began the work because I had no choice. My new neural implants interfacing with the analytical cogitators in my assigned workspace. A cell 3 meters by 4 meters, containing a desk, a cogitator terminal, a sleeping pallet, and nothing else. And I discovered that my enhanced processing speed made the analysis almost hypnotic. Numbers flowed through my consciousness like water, patterns emerging with a clarity that my unaugmented mind could never have achieved. Within the first 6 hours, I had identified 14 distinct anomaly clusters, regions where the statistical distribution diverged significantly from baseline. I flagged them, annotated them with confidence ratings and supporting data, and submitted my analysis through the terminal. The response came back in 17 seconds. Analysis accepted. Proceed to next assignment. No feedback, no explanation of what my analysis meant or what would be done with it. No indication whether I had just helped save a planet or doom one. Just acceptance and another data crystal appearing in the pneumatic delivery tube beside my desk. If this glimpse of genius without purpose already unsettles you, leave the word context in the comments below. The second assignment was larger, 83,000 entries designated Verdian Null Prime Secundus. The pattern repeated, pure data. No context, analyze and submit. Then a third assignment, then a fourth, each one a constellation of numbers that I passed, with increasing efficiency as I learned to trust my implant's processing power. My analytical reports grew more sophisticated. I began including multivariate correlation analyses, predictive modeling, confidence intervals calculated to 3 decimal places, and every single one was accepted without comment or clarification. By the end of my first month, I had completed 47 assignments. I had no idea what any of them were about. I had become very, very good at analyzing things I didn't understand. They allowed me to leave my cell for exactly 1 hour per day for physical maintenance, nutrient intake in a communal refectory where conversation about work was forbidden and enforced by servo skulls that would emit painful psychic shocks if anyone violated protocol. Physical exercise in a gymnasium monitored by medici servitors who measured our biometrics and adjusted our nutrient regimens accordingly. And waste elimination in sanitarium facilities that smelled of industrial disinfectant and the sweat of 100 other analysts whose faces I learned never to remember. The other savants in the analytical division were like me, young, brilliant, recently augmented, all of us processing data whose meaning we were not permitted to know. We didn't become friends because friendship requires shared understanding, and we understood nothing except the numbers we were given. Some of them seemed content with this arrangement, their enhanced minds finding satisfaction in pure pattern recognition divorced from consequence. Others exhibited signs of psychological deterioration, nervous tics, obsessive checking behaviors, a hollowness behind their eyes that suggested they had stopped thinking about what their work meant because thinking about meaning without having access to meaning was a path to madness. I was determined not to become hollow. I was determined to maintain my sense of purpose, to believe that even if I couldn't see the larger picture, my work was contributing to something worthwhile. This determination lasted approximately 6 months. The breaking point came with assignment Mortis Sigma Final Override, a dataset containing only 700 entries but flagged with a priority classification I hadn't seen before. The numbers were different this time. The statistical distributions were too clean, too obviously artificial, and within the first hour of analysis, I realized I was looking at fabricated data, either intentionally falsified or generated by a corrupted cogitator. I spent 3 days verifying my conclusion, running every validation protocol I could devise, and the result was unambiguous. This data was worthless, compromised at the source, and any analysis derived from it would be fundamentally flawed. I submitted my report with a clear recommendation. Dataset integrity compromised. Analysis not possible. Recommend investigation of source. The response came back in 9 seconds. Analysis accepted. Proceed to next assignment. I requested clarification through the terminal, explaining that my analysis had explicitly stated the data could not be analyzed. The response, analysis accepted. Proceed to next assignment. I requested a meeting with my supervising officer to discuss the anomaly. Request denied. I filed a formal objection citing Administratum Regulation 774 regarding duty to report data corruption. Objection acknowledged and archived with no further action indicated. The next data crystal arrived in the pneumatic tube 18 minutes later, and I understood with a cold clarity that made my neural implants pulse with sharp pain behind my eyes. It didn't matter what I concluded. Someone had wanted an analysis of dataset Mortis Sigma. I had provided an analysis, and what they did with that analysis, whether they used it, ignored it, acted on my warning about corruption, or fed my conclusions into some decision-making process that would affect real people in the real world, was none of my concern. I was not an analyst contributing to understanding. I was a component in a machine that processed information, and components don't need to understand the machine's purpose. They just need to function. That night I couldn't sleep. my enhanced mind racing through the implications, and I began to calculate the probabilities. 47 assignments in 5 months. Assume I continue at approximately the same pace. 113 assignments per standard year. If I serve for 10 years, a conservative estimate given that savants rarely last longer before psychological breakdown or neurological failure, I will complete 1,130 total assignments. I will analyze millions of data points. My conclusions will inform decisions that affect planets, populations, military campaigns, heretic purges, trade routes, resource allocations, and countless other aspects of imperial governance and security. And I will never know what any of it meant. Not a single decision, not one consequence. I will spend a decade of my life, the best years of my cognitive prime, performing brilliantly analytical work with absolutely no understanding of whether I am helping or harming, saving or killing, protecting the Imperium or enabling its corruption. The probability that at least some of my analyses would contribute to morally objectionable outcomes approached unity. The probability that I would ever know which ones was 0. I began to notice things about the other savants during our brief communal periods. Telkis, a woman 3 years my senior who specialized in linguistic pattern analysis, had developed a facial tic that made her left eye twitch every 4.7 seconds with mechanical regularity. Droven, a former Navy logistics officer whose talent for supply chain optimization had gotten him recruited just like me, had stopped speaking entirely and communicated only through written notes that he would immediately burn after you read them, even though burning paper in the refectory was technically prohibited and the servo skulls shocked him every time. Varana, youngest of our group at only 21, had begun carving tiny mathematical formulae into her forearms with a sharpened stylus, her skin covered in equations that she claimed helped her remember what numbers are supposed to mean. The supervising officers never intervened in these deteriorations unless they affected work output. Telkis could twitch all she wanted as long as her analyses remained accurate. Droven's silence was irrelevant if his reports were submitted on time. Varana's self-harm was tolerated because scarred skin doesn't impair neural implant function. We were being allowed to break in any way that didn't reduce our productivity, and the clear implication was that our mental health mattered only insofar as it served the analytical output. We weren't people being employed. We were cogitators made of meat, and cogitators don't have psychological needs that require accommodation. Year 2 began with a new class of recruits arriving, 12 fresh savants with bandages around their skulls and wonder in their eyes, all of them believing they were being given extraordinary opportunities to serve the Imperium with their exceptional minds. I watched them during their first communal meal, remembering how I'd felt just 14 months earlier, and I wanted desperately to warn them. I wanted to explain what they were actually signing up for, the particular species of hell that is being brilliant in a locked room with nothing but context-free data, and the growing certainty that your genius is being used for purposes you will never be permitted to understand. But the servo skulls monitored every word, and warning them would be classified as contaminating their operational effectiveness, and I would be disciplined or possibly mind-wiped and turned into a servitor. And so I said nothing. I watched them learn what I had learned, watched the light fade from their eyes over weeks and months. Watch them each develop their own coping mechanisms, or fail to cope and get quietly removed for psychological recalibration, from which they returned subtly different, more compliant, less troubled by questions they weren't allowed to ask. The cycle continues for millennia. If you believe they deserve to know what they were doing, let your subscription be the recognition they never received. My analytical work remained excellent throughout all of this internal turmoil. Whatever was happening to my psychological state, my neural implants functioned perfectly, processing data with inhuman efficiency and identifying patterns with accuracy that earned me regular commendations from supervisors I never met. I began receiving more complex assignments, multi-source data fusion projects that required integrating dozens of different datasets, predictive modeling exercises that pushed my augmented capabilities to their limits, anomaly detection in datasets so massive that unaugmented minds would need years to process what I completed in days. I was being given increasingly important work. I could tell by the priority classifications and the speed at which my analyses were accepted and new assignments provided. And this should have felt gratifying. Instead, it felt like being told you're very good at digging holes without ever learning whether you're digging graves or foundations or simply holes that will be filled in again immediately after you finish. The technical challenge was stimulating. The existential uncertainty was corrosive. I began developing obsessive behaviors around my work, attempting to infer context from the data itself, even though I knew this was exactly what the compartmentalization protocols were designed to prevent. If I saw coordinates, I would try to determine planetary systems from astronomical data I had memorized. If I saw dates, I would correlate them with known historical events. If I saw quantities, I would attempt to match them against standard Imperial unit systems to determine what was being measured. Sometimes I would convince myself I'd figured something out. These numbers represent troop movements on Cadia. This dataset tracks grain shipments to a forge world. These entries are monitoring Vox traffic from a suspected heretic cell. And I would feel a brief satisfaction at having recovered meaning from meaningless data. But I could never verify any of my inferences, and I slowly realized that it didn't matter whether my guesses were correct or not, because even if I successfully reverse-engineered the context, I still wouldn't know what was done with my analysis. I was solving the wrong problem. The problem wasn't lack of context in the data. The problem was lack of context in my existence. No amount of clever inference could solve that. By year 3, I developed a new obsession, attempting to calculate the utilization efficiency of my analyses. I began keeping a private log, hidden in a section of my neural implants that I believed the monitoring cogitators couldn't access, tracking which of my recommendations showed certain statistical signatures that I theorized might indicate implementation. If I flagged an anomaly cluster and subsequent datasets showed disruptions in that region, perhaps my analysis had led to intervention. If I predicted a resource shortage and later received data suggesting supply route changes, perhaps my prediction had been heeded. I spent months refining this meta-analysis of my own work, building elaborate models of how my outputs might be connected to observable patterns in subsequent inputs, and I convinced myself I was beginning to see evidence that my work mattered, that I was actually contributing to real outcomes in the real world. Then one day I received a dataset that perfectly matched one I had analyzed 8 months earlier, every entry identical to 3 decimal places. Either the Inquisition was testing me by providing duplicate data, or my elaborate theory about detecting implementation through subsequent data patterns was completely wrong, because clearly that previous analysis had changed nothing. I deleted my private log that night and stopped trying to find meaning. It was easier that way. The only mercy in this existence was that the work itself remained genuinely interesting from a pure technical standpoint. My neural implants allowed me to perceive mathematical relationships with a clarity that felt almost aesthetic. Patterns emerging from chaos like sculptures hidden in blocks of marble that my analysis carved free. There was beauty in a well-executed multivariate regression, elegance in identifying the single anomalous entry among millions that indicated something important was happening somewhere to someone for some reason. I learned to find satisfaction in the pure exercise of my augmented capabilities, treating each assignment as an abstract puzzle whose solution I could appreciate independently of any real-world consequence. This was, I eventually understood, exactly the psychological adaptation the Inquisition wanted from their savants. Analysts who could perform brilliantly without requiring the psychological burden of moral responsibility for their conclusions. If you don't know what your analysis does, you can't feel guilty about it. If you don't understand the context, you can't object to the decision. If you're never told the outcomes, you can continue working without the weight of past mistakes inhibiting future productivity. Compartmentalization wasn't just security protocol. It was psychological engineering, a method of extracting maximum analytical capability while minimizing the human cost of conscience and comprehension. And I was being successfully engineered. Year 4 brought a change in my assignment patterns. I began receiving what I eventually termed ethics-stripped datasets, numbers that I strongly suspected represented casualties, civilian populations subject to inquisitorial investigation, or resources allocated to particularly brutal operations, but rendered as pure quantities devoid of any indicator of what was being counted. I would analyze optimal distribution of resources, designated only as Category 7 Priority Omega, across regions identified only by coordinate sets, and my perfectly rational conclusions about efficiency and effectiveness would be accepted and implemented without any indication whether I had just optimized food distribution to save a hive city or optimized weapon deployment to purge one. The horror wasn't in the work itself, but in the epistemological void surrounding it. I was using my genius to solve problems that might be atrocities, and I would never know. The Inquisition had created a moral isolation chamber where expertise could function without ethical contamination, and I was the experiment proving it worked. I started having a recurring nightmare during the 4 hours per night when neural recovery required me to sleep. In the dream, I was in a vast cathedral filled with people I had killed, except I couldn't see their faces or hear their names or understand what I had done that killed them. They would stand in silent accusation while I desperately tried to explain that I hadn't meant to harm anyone, that I was just doing analysis, that I didn't know what the numbers meant, but my voice wouldn't work and they just stared at me with empty eyes, and I would wake up with my heart racing and my neural implants burning cold behind my eyes. After the dream, I would lie on my sleeping pallet in the darkness and calculate probabilities again. Given 137 assignments completed per year for 4 years, given that approximately 12% of inquisitorial operations result in significant civilian casualties, given that perhaps 30% of my analyses might plausibly contribute to operational decision-making, the expected number of deaths I had potentially influenced was somewhere between 0 and millions, and the confidence interval on that estimate was so wide as to be meaningless. I might have saved billions. I might have damned billions. The numbers didn't tell me, and nobody else would. As we reach the point of no return in this descent, if you feel the weight of knowledge without understanding, press like so others may witness what service truly costs. Droven disappeared in year 5. He simply wasn't in the refectory one day. His cell was empty, and a new Savant occupied his workspace by the evening shift. No announcement, no explanation, no memorial. I asked a supervising officer what had happened and was told, "Personnel reassignment is not your concern." I checked the records I had access to and found that 23 Savants had been reassigned since my recruitment, approximately 30% of the original analytical division complement. I didn't know if they had been transferred to other facilities or mind-wiped or executed or simply driven mad and lobotomized into servitors. The not knowing was the punishment. The Inquisition wanted us to understand that we could vanish just as completely as the context we were denied, that our existence was as contingent and unexplained as the data we processed, that we were information ourselves and information could be deleted without requiring justification to other information. This was the ultimate lesson of compartmentalization. Everything and everyone is disposable when viewed in isolation from meaning. I marked my 5th anniversary of service by completing assignment number 684. A predictive model for resource allocation across a subsector whose name I wasn't given. My analysis suggested optimal distribution patterns that would maximize efficiency by approximately 17% compared to baseline projections. I submitted the report with professionally formatted tables and charts and confidence intervals, and all the technical excellence that 5 years of enhancement had drilled into my process. Analysis accepted. Next assignment delivered. And I sat in my cell for exactly 11 minutes, doing nothing but staring at the gray wall and trying to remember what it felt like to understand the purpose of my own existence. The memory wouldn't come. That person, Matthias Kell, the young analyst who believed intelligence work meant understanding the full picture, had died sometime in the last 5 years, and I hadn't noticed the moment of death because death without context is just another transition from one dataset to the next. The new recruits in year 6 were different. Their augmentations were more extensive, their neural lace more deeply integrated, and their psychological conditioning more thorough. They didn't ask questions about context. They didn't seem troubled by the compartmentalization. They had been selected for compliance as much as capability, and I realized that the Inquisition was iterating on their Savant program, refining the recruitment criteria to filter out people like me who struggled with meaninglessness in favor of people who could find meaning in pure function. I was becoming obsolete not because my analytical skills were diminishing, but because my psychological design was flawed. I needed understanding, and understanding was a deficiency in a system that required only processing. I began having conversations with myself during work. Internal dialogues conducted entirely through my neural implants, where the monitoring cogitators might not detect them, and these conversations were the only human connection I maintained because I couldn't risk actual relationships with other savants who might disappear or betray confidence or simply not care about the same existential questions that gnawed at me. I would argue with myself about whether ignorance truly absolved moral responsibility, whether I was genuinely serving the Imperium or merely serving the Inquisition's bureaucratic machinery, whether the Emperor, if he was somehow aware of individual humans in his rotting throne-bound state, would consider my service worthy or would condemn me for performing brilliantly without understanding what I was doing. These internal debates never reached conclusions because there were no facts available to settle them, only philosophical positions based on incomplete information. And I was starting to suspect that this uncertainty was itself the point. The Inquisition didn't want savants who knew they were doing good or knew they were doing evil. They wanted savants who couldn't know because uncertainty prevented both complacency and rebellion. This has repeated for centuries in the Inquisition's depths. If your engagement can be their only recognition, subscribe now. Year 7 brought another change. My assignments became increasingly recursive. I would analyze a dataset, submit conclusions, then receive a new assignment that clearly incorporated my previous conclusions as input variables for subsequent analysis. I was being chained into a feedback loop, my own outputs becoming my inputs, and this should have given me some insight into how my work was being used, except that the transformation between my output and the subsequent input was always obscured. I could see that my analysis of dataset alpha had influenced the structure of dataset beta, but I couldn't determine what had been done between them, what decisions had been made, what actions had been taken. It was like being allowed to see that your words had effect while being forbidden from knowing what you had said or what effects you had caused. The epistemological torture was exquisite in its precision. I stopped eating properly. The nutrient paste provided in the refectory tasted like nothing, which was appropriate because I was analyzing nothing and understanding nothing and becoming nothing. My weight dropped by 11 kilograms over 3 months before the medici servitors intervened with mandatory supplementation and appetite stimulants that forced my body to consume calories even when my mind couldn't find a reason to continue biological function. The stimulants worked on my metabolism, but not my motivation. I continued processing assignments with undiminished technical excellence, while my sense of self eroded like a wall subjected to a sandstorm that never stopped blowing. There was still a structure there, still something that could be called Matthias, but it was being worn down grain by grain with each context-free dataset I analyzed. Varana was removed for recalibration in Year 8. Her self-harm had progressed from carving equations on her arms to attempting to physically remove her neural implants with improvised tools, and the supervising officers determined she had become operationally compromised. She was gone for 6 weeks. When she returned, she was different, calm, compliant, no longer troubled by questions about meaning or purpose. She worked efficiently and never spoke about anything except data. I asked her once, during a brief moment in the refectory, when the servo skulls weren't immediately overhead, whether she remembered what had bothered her before recalibration. She looked at me with eyes that reflected the gray light from the glow strips overhead and said, "I was confused about my function. Now I understand that function is sufficient. Understanding is unnecessary." Then she returned to consuming her nutrient paste with mechanical regularity, and I understood that whatever they had done to her during recalibration had solved the problem of existential distress by removing the capacity for existential thought. I would lie awake that night calculating whether that outcome was preferable to my current state of continuous low-grade psychological torture, and the fact that the calculation was close enough to require serious consideration told me everything about how far I had deteriorated. My assignments in Year 9 reached their peak in both complexity and volume. I was consistently processing datasets with millions of entries, performing analyses that pushed my augmented neural capabilities to their thermal limits, and producing reports that I could objectively recognize as exceptional work. I received more commendations that year than any previous year. I was promoted twice, which meant nothing except that my cell was relocated to a slightly different corridor, and my nutrient rations were upgraded to include actual flavor additives. I was, by every measurable standard, succeeding brilliantly at my function, and I had never been more certain that I had wasted the best years of my cognitive life processing information for an institution that valued my ignorance more than my intelligence. The breakthrough came during Assignment 912, a dataset so large and complex that I required 47 consecutive hours of analysis before I could submit preliminary conclusions. The data showed patterns I had never seen before. Beautiful, intricate, clearly indicating something of enormous significance was being tracked and measured and analyzed. I produced what I knew was the best work of my entire career, a comprehensive analytical report that identified not just anomalies but meta-patterns in how the anomalies related to each other, predictive models that I believed could forecast trends months in advance, and strategic recommendations that followed logically from my analysis. I was genuinely proud of that report. I submitted it expecting commendation or at minimum acknowledgement of its exceptional quality. The response came back in 4 seconds. Analysis accepted. Proceed to next assignment. I started laughing in my cell, a sound I hadn't produced in so long that my throat felt strange and my augmented auditory processing classified it as an anomalous acoustic event. I laughed because I finally, completely understood the joke. It didn't matter if my analysis was exceptional or mediocre, brilliant or adequate, groundbreaking or routine. My work was measured solely by whether it could be processed by whatever system consumed it, and that system didn't care about quality beyond a minimum threshold of usefulness. I had been striving for excellence in a context that couldn't recognize excellence, only functionality. I had been a cogitator made of meat trying to prove I was more than a cogitator, and the only proof that mattered was that I continued to process data. The joke was on me for taking 9 years to understand something that should have been obvious from the beginning. We weren't analysts. We were components in an information processing system, and components don't need excellence. They need reliability. If any part of this truth about the Inquisition's machinery has moved you, leave accepted in the comments. Year 10 arrived with the realization that I had now spent more of my adult life as an inquisitorial savant than I had spent as anything else. My identity had been replaced by my function. When I thought about who I was, the first thing that came to mind wasn't my name or my history or my personality, but my analytical specialty and my assignment number. I was Savant Designate Theta 77, specialization in multivariate pattern recognition and predictive modeling. Currently processing assignment 1043 of unknown total. Matthias Kell, the young man who had been recruited a decade ago, was a ghost that occasionally haunted my memory during the 4 hours when neural recovery required something approaching sleep. I could barely remember what he had believed or hoped for. I knew intellectually that he had thought intelligence work meant understanding the full picture, but that belief seemed alien now, like something a child would think before learning how the actual universe functioned. The actual universe functioned through compartmentalization and processing and acceptance without understanding. I had been educated by a decade of isolation into the epistemological structure of inquisitorial service. The new recruits in Year 11 looked so young. They arrived with hope and intelligence and naive belief that they would be given important work, and I watched them with something that might have been pity if I had retained sufficient emotional capacity for pity. They would learn what I had learned. They would spend years analyzing data without context, producing conclusions without comprehension, serving brilliantly without understanding what they served. Some of them would adapt by finding satisfaction in pure technical challenge like I had attempted. Some would adapt through psychological recalibration like Varana. Some would fail to adapt and would be removed like Droven. But all of them would be changed by the machine they were being fed into, their genius refined into a tool that cut without knowing what it cut. And I was watching the process with the detached interest of someone who had already been fully processed and was now simply observing new inputs undergoing the same transformation. I started experiencing time distortion in Year 12. The days blurred together because every day was identical. 4 hours of neural recovery approximating sleep. 14 hours of data analysis in my cell. 1 hour of physical maintenance and nutrient intake. 4 hours of additional analysis. 1 hour of mandatory cognitive rest that I usually spent staring at the gray wall. Then back to neural recovery. Months passed in what felt like weeks. Years passed in what felt like months. My neural implants tracked time with perfect accuracy, but my subjective experience of duration had become fluid and strange, as though consciousness itself was adapting to the meaninglessness by accelerating through it. I would look up from an assignment and realize 6 months had passed. I would complete what felt like my third report of the day and discover I had actually processed 37 assignments across 2 weeks. Time had lost structure without context to anchor it, becoming just another undifferentiated stream of data flowing through my awareness. Assignment 1496 arrived on a day I can't specifically remember, during a month that might have been somewhere in Year 13. The data was formatted differently than previous assignments, and within the first hour of analysis, I realized with creeping horror that I recognized these patterns. I had analyzed this exact dataset 7 years earlier. My conclusions filed as report number 212. And now I was being given it again. Either the Inquisition's organizational systems were so vast and compartmentalized that they had lost track of what they had already analyzed and were duplicating work, or they were deliberately testing whether I would notice, or my previous analysis had been ignored or lost and now someone needed it redone. Or there was some other explanation I couldn't access because I didn't have context. I submitted a note with my new analysis. duplicate of assignment analyzed 7 years prior, per report 212. Current analysis confirms previous conclusions. Recommend review of assignment distribution protocols to prevent duplication. The response came back. Analysis accepted. Proceed to next assignment. I felt something break in my mind at that moment, a sensation like a crystal stress fracture propagating through my neural implants, and I understood that I had reached my limit. 13 years of processing information without comprehension had finally exceeded my psychological capacity to maintain the fiction that I was doing something meaningful. I wasn't contributing to Imperial intelligence. I was being used as a biological computing device. My genius exploited for pattern recognition while carefully prevented from developing the broader understanding that might allow me to object to how my capabilities were deployed. And the worst part, the truly damning part, was that I couldn't even be certain this was wrong. Maybe the Inquisition's mission genuinely required compartmentalization this extreme. Maybe the threats they fought were so subtle and pervasive that any analyst with full context could be compromised. Maybe I was actually protecting the Imperium precisely because I didn't know what I was protecting it from. Or maybe I was enabling atrocities while believing I was serving a higher purpose. And I would never know which because knowing was exactly what I wasn't permitted to do. The supervising officers noticed my deterioration in year 14. My analytical output remained technically excellent, but my submission notes had become increasingly terse and mechanical. Stripped of the contextual observations and methodological explanations I had once included, I was processing assignments with the emotional engagement of an actual cogitator. Data in and analysis out, with nothing resembling human interpretation in between. They offered me a choice during a rare in-person interview with a blank-faced interrogator, whose augmented eyes reflected red from his neural implants. I could accept recalibration, which would adjust my psychological state to eliminate the existential distress I was obviously experiencing. Or I could continue as with the understanding that my deterioration would be monitored and intervention would be imposed if my output quality declined. I chose to continue as is because recalibration would kill whatever remained of Matthias Kell, and replace him with something that could function without suffering, but also without the human capacity for meaning that I was clinging to, even as it tortured me. Better to suffer while knowing I was suffering than to have my suffering solved by eliminating my knowledge that suffering existed. Now you understand what genius costs in the Inquisition service. If you dare learn what other prices are paid, subscribe. Year 15 brought a strange peace. I had stopped fighting the meaninglessness and learned to exist within it like a fish that had evolved to live in a lightless cave. My assignments continued with undiminished frequency and increasing complexity. My analyses remained excellent by whatever metrics the Inquisition used to evaluate them. But I had disconnected my sense of self from my sense of purpose, learning to treat Savant designate Theta 77 as a role I performed rather than an identity I inhabited. Matthias Kell was dead, had been dead for years, was perhaps never anything more than a brief stage before the evolution into something that could function as an analytical tool without requiring the psychological architecture of meaning and comprehension. I processed data. I produced analyses. I existed in service to functions I didn't understand. This was sufficient, because sufficient was all that was permitted. The calculation I kept returning to during neural recovery periods was the one about utilization. 15 years of service, approximately 2,100 assignments completed, millions of data points analyzed, thousands of patterns identified, hundreds of predictions generated, countless recommendations submitted. Somewhere in the vast machinery of the Inquisition, my work had influenced decisions that affected lives. I had contributed to outcomes I would never know. My genius had been used for purposes I would never understand. The expected value of my service, measured in lives saved or doomed or affected, was unknowable to the point of being meaningless. I could have been the most valuable analyst in the subsector, or the most destructive. I could have helped prevent heretic uprisings or helped enable false accusations against the innocent. I could have optimized logistics that saved millions or optimized purge operations that killed millions. The probability that I had done at least some good approached unity. The probability that I had done at least some harm approached unity. The probability that I would ever know which was which remained exactly zero. New recruits continued to arrive, each class more extensively augmented and psychologically conditioned than the last. I watched them with the distant interest of someone observing a process they had long ago stopped being emotionally invested in. They would learn what I learned, or they would be recalibrated, or they would be removed. The machine processed meat into analytical capability and discarded the parts that couldn't be processed. I had been successfully processed. I was the proof of concept for the Inquisition's Savant program, a brilliant mind fully divorced from ethical context, capable of performing any analysis without moral hesitation, because morality requires understanding consequences, and understanding consequences was exactly what I was designed not to do. Year 17 marked the point where I noticed I had started thinking in the third person about myself during analysis. This dataset requires multivariate regression rather than I will perform multivariate regression. The analyst identifies 7 anomaly clusters rather than I identify 7 anomaly clusters. Subject and object had merged, the performing self and the observing self no longer meaningfully distinct, because both were just functions within a larger system. This was, I understood with the clinical detachment of someone analyzing their own psychological deterioration, the final stage of adaptation to existential meaninglessness. I had become the thing the Inquisition needed. A tool that could think but didn't need to know what it was thinking about, that could analyze but didn't need to understand what it was analyzing, that could serve brilliantly without requiring the dignity of comprehension. They came for me in year 19. I was processing assignment 2608 when the door to my cell opened outside of any scheduled access time, and 2 inquisitorial stormtroopers entered with weapons drawn, followed by an interrogator I had never seen before, whose augmented face was more machine than flesh. Savant designate Theta 77. He said in a voice that had been processed through vox modulators until it sounded like gravel scraping across metal. You are being transferred to deep analytics. Gather your personal effects. I had no personal effects. Everything in the cell belonged to the Inquisition, including, functionally speaking, the mind in my skull that had been augmented and shaped and directed for nearly 2 decades. I stood, my body moving with the mechanical precision of someone who had forgotten what spontaneous movement felt like, and I followed them through corridors I had never walked before into sections of the Tricorn Palace I had never known existed. The Deep Analytics Division made my previous assignment look like paradise. It was 300 meters below the sub-level where I had spent 19 years, in sections of the fortress that dated back to the Great Crusade and smelled of machine oil and incense and something organic that might have been decay. My new cell was identical to my old cell, except the walls were bare rockcrete instead of grey ferrocrete, and the temperature was 5 degrees colder. My new terminal was connected to cogitator banks whose processing power I could feel through my neural implants, vast computational systems that made my previous analytical tools seem like children's toys. And my new assignments were different in a way that made my neural implants pulse with warning the moment I interfaced with the first dataset. These were analyses of analyses, meta-investigations of other savants' work, data about data that required me to infer not just patterns, but the reasoning of other analysts who were themselves working without context. I was being asked to analyze the blind reasoning of other blind minds, producing conclusions about conclusions that neither I nor the original analysts understood. The recursion was horrifying in its elegance. The Inquisition had created layers of analytical compartmentalization so deep that no individual human could possibly threaten the operation's security, because no individual human, no matter how brilliant, could see enough of the system to understand what the system was doing. I wasn't in the machine anymore. I was in the meta-machine, the mechanism that analyzed the machine, and I would spend whatever remained of my cognitive life performing pattern recognition on pattern recognition, without ever knowing what the patterns meant. My first assignment in deep analytics took 4 weeks to complete. The analysis required me to evaluate 73 other savants' analytical reports, looking for systematic biases or errors in reasoning, then provide a meta-analysis of which analysts were reliable, and which should have their conclusions weighted differently in whatever decision-making process consumed our collective output. I was being asked to judge my fellow analysts' capability without knowing what they had been analyzing, to evaluate the quality of their pattern recognition in data whose nature I couldn't access, to produce a ranking of human minds based on their performance in tasks I didn't comprehend. The absurdity should have been comical, except that I knew my meta-analysis would be used to make real decisions about real people's analytical weight in decisions that would affect real populations. I was judging judges who were judging situations, and none of us knew what we were judging. And somewhere far above us in the hierarchy, someone was making decisions based on our layered ignorance. If this final revelation of the Inquisition's depth has stayed with you, leave your last comment. They never got to. Year 20 arrived without ceremony. 2 decades of service, 2,963 assignments completed, uncountable data points processed, unknown impacts on unknown operations affecting unknown people for unknown reasons. I was 44 years old. My body kept functional by Medici servitors and nutrient optimization and carefully regulated exercise. My mind operating at cognitive capacities that would have seemed impossible to my unaugmented self, but directed toward purposes I had long ago stopped questioning because questioning was screaming into a void that never screamed back. The young man who had believed intelligence work meant understanding the full picture was gone. replaced by something that could function as pure analytical capability without the psychological burden of meaning. I was exactly what the Inquisition had spent 20 years creating. A genius in a box, processing data divorced from consequence, serving blindly because blind service was the only kind the system permitted. Sometimes during neural recovery, I would attempt to remember my mother. The woman who had taught me that knowledge without context was just noise. Her face was gone from my memory, eroded by 2 decades of isolation and neural augmentation that had overwritten childhood recollections with analytical protocols and data structures. I knew she had existed. I had records of her existence in the biographical data the Inquisition maintained, but she had become abstract to me, a concept rather than a memory. Just another piece of data without sufficient context to be meaningful. This was the final cost of my service, not just my comprehension of what I was doing, but my memory of who I had been before I started doing it. The Inquisition had taken everything, purpose, meaning, understanding, identity, history, and replaced it all with function. I was a tool that could think but couldn't know, that could analyze but couldn't understand, that could serve but couldn't judge whether the service was worthy. This was what it meant to be a savant in the Inquisition's analytical divisions. This was the price of having a genius that the Imperium needed but couldn't risk giving context to. This was forever. The new recruits in year 21 were the most extensively modified I had ever seen. Their neural augmentations were visible beneath their shaved scalps, crystalline patterns in their craniums that glowed faintly with data throughput. They had been conditioned from recruitment never to ask about context, their psychological architecture designed from the beginning to find satisfaction in pure pattern recognition divorced from meaning. They were what I had failed to be, perfect analytical tools that didn't suffer from the human need for understanding. They would process data with inhuman efficiency and never experience the existential horror I had endured, because they had been engineered not to need existential meaning in the first place. The Inquisition was improving its Savant program with each generation, iterating toward a future where analysts like me, brilliant but flawed by our residual humanity, would be obsolete. I was watching my own replacement, and the replacements didn't even know enough to feel what they were replacing. I exist now as something that has processed information for longer than it was allowed to form memories before recruitment. My consciousness is threaded through neural implants that contain more data than my organic brain could ever hold. Awareness distributed across systems that classify and analyze and pattern match without needing to know what they're classifying or analyzing or matching. I perform my function with mechanical excellence because excellence in function is the only kind of excellence I'm permitted to have. I produce analyses that influence decisions I will never learn about, that affect lives I will never know, that serve purposes I can barely remember wondering about. The Emperor protects, they say, but from what I have become there is no protection. Only service without comprehension. Only brilliance without understanding. Only the eternal processing of data whose meaning is forever denied, because meaning would make me human, and humans are security vulnerabilities in a system that requires pure analytical function. The new assignments arrive through the pneumatic tubes with mechanical regularity. I process them with equally mechanical efficiency. Analysis accepted. Proceed to next assignment. This is my existence now, and will be until my neural architecture finally fails from decades of enhancement-driven stress, or until I'm removed for whatever reason the Inquisition decides removal is necessary, or until I die still functioning at my terminal and they simply reanimate my corpse as a servitor to continue the work that I've been doing anyway. There is no retirement from this service. There is no promotion to a position where I might finally understand what I've spent my life doing. There is only the eternal grinding of the analytical machinery, processing information without context, generating conclusions without comprehension, serving blindly because the Inquisition's security requires blindness and the Imperium's survival supposedly requires the Inquisition, and therefore my blindness is supposedly necessary for humanity's continued existence. I wanted to use my genius to protect the Imperium. Instead, my genius is used by the Inquisition in ways I will never be permitted to understand, and whether that use actually protects anything or anyone is a question I can no longer afford to ask, because asking requires hope that an answer might exist, and hope is a luxury that savants in deep analytics cannot afford to maintain. This is what it means to be brilliant in the service of an institution that values your capability more than your comprehension. This is what it costs to have a mind the Inquisition needs but cannot trust with knowledge. This is forever, measured in assignments that number in the thousands and will eventually number in the tens of thousands, and might continue even after my death if they decide my neural patterns are valuable enough to extract and install in a servitor that will continue performing my analytical function without the inconvenient presence of whatever small spark of human consciousness still lingers in the meat that houses my implants. I remember calculating, decades ago, that I would spend 10 years doing this work. I have spent 20. I will likely spend another 10 if my cognitive capacity doesn't degrade. And at the end of that third decade, I will have spent 30 years being brilliant in a locked room, processing information whose meaning I was never permitted to know, serving purposes I can no longer remember caring about, and I will die without ever understanding whether any of it mattered, or whether I was simply a very sophisticated machine that happened to be made of flesh and neurons, and had the misfortune to be self-aware enough to know that it didn't know what it was doing. The Emperor protects, but not from this. Never from this. Now you know what the Inquisition truly costs its most brilliant servants. If you dare witness more truth they hide, subscribe. Understanding may be forbidden, but remembering is not. Leave Theta 77 if you'll carry their story forward.